The Nexus Military Academy floated in the shadow of Kepler-7's third moon, like a metallic tumor, all sharp angles and gleaming surfaces that screamed, "We take ourselves very seriously here." Which was accurate, considering it housed the galaxy's most ambitious attempt at creating a truly integrated military force. 4 to 7 different species, each convinced that particular brand of aggression was superior, all crammed together in what administrators cheerfully called harmonious cooperation and what everyone else called barely controlled chaos waiting to happen. The Academy's founding charter spoke eloquently of universal standards, equal treatment, and shared values. What it didn't mention was that universal became significantly less universal when you factored in beings who breathed methane, reproduced through spore clouds, or considered photosynthesis a viable career path. The compromise had been elegant in its simplicity: make everyone equally miserable, and call it fair. Drill Instructor Vex'andra embodied this philosophy with the zealous dedication of someone who had found their true calling in making others question their life choices. Standing 7 feet tall on digitigrade legs, with 4 arms that could simultaneously demonstrate 17 different ways to cause pain, she represented the Keltharian military tradition of suffer now, thank us later. Her chitinous exoskeleton bore scars from 3 different wars, 2 diplomatic incidents, and 1 particularly aggressive graduation ceremony. Her office walls displayed commendations from grateful commanders, terrified testimonials from former recruits, and a small, tasteful shrine to the concept of equal opportunity misery. Vex'andra believed deeply that pain was the universe's most democratic force. Didn't matter if you had scales, feathers, or that disturbing habit of occasionally existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously, everyone could suffer, and therefore everyone should suffer. It built character, she claimed, though critics noted it also built an alarming number of psychiatric evaluation requests. The morning that would later be marked in Academy records as the day we learned why humans come with warning labels began with typical bureaucratic optimism. A fresh batch of recruits had arrived overnight, representing 12 different species, and what the admissions officer had cheerfully described as a delightful variety of biological challenges. Vex'andra reviewed the roster with her usual predatory enthusiasm. There was Zeph-9, a crystalline being whose species communicated through harmonic resonance and considered personal space a flexible concept. The file noted they could accidentally shatter windows when excited. Beside that name sat Coordinator Flux, who wasn't technically an individual, but rather a fragment of a hive mind that had gotten curious about military service. Their presence came with a 2-page addendum about not letting them near communications equipment. Then there was the Galorian gas form entity who went by the being formerly known as atmospheric disturbance, which Vex'andra suspected was either a translation error or evidence that some species had too much time on their tentacles. The recruits file was mostly warnings about not using electrical equipment in their vicinity and keeping the ventilation systems on high. At the bottom of the list, almost as an afterthought, was the human. The file was surprisingly thin. Just basic biometrics, a note about standard atmospheric requirements, and a psychological evaluation that used the phrase within normal parameters 17 times. Which should have been the first warning sign. Really. When a species' psychological profile needed that much reassurance about normalcy, there was usually a reason. But Vex'andra had seen it all. Gas forms, hive minds, beings that existed partially in folded spacetime. What could one little biped possibly bring to the table that would surprise her? She'd broken recruits who could bench press small spacecraft and reduced warriors who breathed plasma to homesick tears. Humans, from what she'd heard, were just another carbon-based life form with delusions of adequacy. The first day of training began with Vex'andra's traditional welcome speech, delivered in her parade ground voice that could strip paint at 50 yards. "Listen carefully, because I'm only going to explain this once," she announced, her forearms spread wide in a gesture that somehow managed to be both welcoming and threatening. "I don't care what world you crawled out of, what your atmospheric preferences are, or whether your species reproduces through spore clouds, interpretive dance, or aggressive negotiation. Here, you are all equally pathetic." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled recruits. The crystalline being chimed nervously. The gas form entity swirled with what might have been anxiety. The hive mind fragment buzzed in several harmonized frequencies that roughly translated to "Oh day." "There will be no special treatment," Vex'andra continued. No accommodations for your precious biological quirks. No consideration for your cultural preferences. If you require a specific atmospheric composition to survive, you will learn to hold your breath. If your species finds physical contact traumatic, you will learn to enjoy group hugs. If you communicate through bioluminescent displays, you will learn to do it quietly. The human recruit stood at attention with the others, appearing utterly unremarkable. Average height for their species, standard issue training gear, an expression of polite attention that suggested they were listening but not particularly concerned. Nothing about them screamed special handling required or approach with caution. They looked, for all intents and purposes, like the kind of recruit who would wash out in the first week and spend the rest of their life telling bar stories about almost joining the military. Which made it all the more puzzling when Vex'andra returned to her office after the morning session to find the first sign. It was small, printed on Regulation Academy stationery, and attached to her desk with official adhesive strips. Atmospheric processes on standby, facility maintenance. It read in the bland, bureaucratic font that made everything sound simultaneously important and boring. Vex'andra stared at it for several seconds, then methodically removed it and dropped it in the waste disposal unit. By the end of the week, they were multiplying. Gravity generators operating at maximum tolerance appeared on her office wall. Emergency medical team, 24/7 rotation schedule was stuck to her coffee dispenser. Structural integrity monitors, active status, somehow found its way onto her bathroom mirror, which raised questions about maintenance access protocols that she decided she didn't want answered. The most irritating part wasn't the signs themselves, it was their studied vagueness. They never mentioned which recruit they were referencing, never explained what exactly was being monitored or why. They simply appeared, like bureaucratic mushrooms, sprouting in the damp corners of administrative oversight. Vex'andra's first attempt to address the situation involved a strongly worded communication to Base Command. "I will not," she wrote with the righteous fury of someone whose entire worldview was being questioned, "tolerate special treatment for any recruit. The signs suggest preferential monitoring and emergency preparedness for an individual who has shown no indication of requiring such measures. This undermines the fundamental principle of equal treatment that makes military training effective." The response arrived within hours, which was unusual enough to be alarming. Base Command communications typically moved with the speed and efficiency of a three-legged Brontillian pack animal, but this had obviously been prioritized. The message was brief and unhelpful. Signs are standard precautionary measures. Continue normal training protocols. Do not deviate from established procedures. Which raised more questions than it answered, but Vex'andra was nothing if not dedicated to her craft. If Command wanted normal training protocols, they would get normal training protocols with extra emphasis on the normal. She doubled down on her equal opportunity misery philosophy, designing exercises that would test every recruit's limits regardless of their biological configuration. The crystalline being learned to navigate obstacle courses without shattering themselves on low-hanging barriers. The gas form entity discovered they could maintain cohesion even under stress, though they did tend to smell faintly of ozone when agitated. The hive mind fragment adapted to operating independently, though they occasionally forgot which thoughts belonged to whom and ended up giving themselves orders in different dialects. And the human? The human performed adequately. Not brilliantly, not terribly, just adequately. They completed physical training without complaint, followed orders with polite efficiency, and showed no particular aptitude for violence, leadership, or the kind of inspired creative problem-solving that usually marked promising recruits. Which made the escalating warning signs all the more baffling. Hazmat team briefed on containment protocols appeared in her equipment locker. Quarantine procedures updated. Latest revision was somehow embedded in her training schedule. Next of kin notifications. Templates prepared showed up in her personal quarters, which violated so many privacy regulations that Vex'andra spent an entire evening drafting complaints she was too annoyed to send. The other recruits began to notice. The crystalline being's harmonic resonance took on worried overtones whenever they were assigned to the same training group as the human. The gas form entity started maintaining extra distance, their usual swirling patterns becoming tight, nervous spirals. Even the hive mind fragment seemed unsettled, occasionally emitting discordant buzzes that roughly translated to "something is not quite right here," and we are experiencing collective unease about it. Vex'andra's frustration reached critical mass during a routine combat simulation. She had designed the exercise specifically to test each recruit's ability to adapt under pressure, a multi-environment scenario that required navigation through a zero-gravity chamber, a high-pressure water section, and a final arena filled with harmless but disorienting holographic obstacles. The crystalline being navigated the course with careful precision, their natural hardness providing advantages in some sections while creating challenges in others. The gas-form entity flowed through obstacles with elegant efficiency, though they got briefly confused in the water section and had to reconstitute themselves twice. The hive mind fragment approached each challenge with methodical planning, occasionally consulting themselves for second opinions. The human approached it like they were running errands. Not casually, they maintained proper form and followed procedures. But there was something in their demeanor that suggested this level of physical stress and environmental challenge was, if not exactly routine, then at least not particularly noteworthy. They moved through the zero-gravity section with the competence of someone who had clearly spent time in similar conditions. They handled the high-pressure water with efficient breathing techniques that spoke of experience rather than training. In the final arena, when holographic attackers materialized around them, they responded with a calm, methodical approach to violence that was somehow more unsettling than panic would have been. It was during this exercise that Vex'andra noticed the newest additions to her growing collection of warning signs. These were different, more specific, more urgent. Psychological counselors standing by had appeared on her personal communication device. Incident report templates, multiple casualty was stuck to her emergency procedures manual. Most disturbing of all, diplomatic immunity waivers, expedited processing had somehow been slipped into her daily briefing packet. That evening, she cornered the base medical officer in the commissary. Dr. Kelethvar was a Rendoran whose species had evolved to be naturally calming. Their blue-green skin contained bioluminescent patterns that induced relaxation in most carbon-based life forms, and their voice carried subsonic frequencies that reduced anxiety. They were exactly the sort of being you wanted explaining medical procedures or delivering bad news, which made it particularly unsettling when Dr. Kelethvar went slightly pale at the mention of human physiology. The signs, Vex'andra said without preamble, sliding into the seat across from the doctor. The warnings about atmospheric processes and emergency medical teams. They are about the human recruit, aren't they? Dr. Kelethvar's bioluminescent patterns flickered in what Vex'andra recognized as the Rendoran equivalent of nervous laughter. I'm not sure what you mean. All recruits receive appropriate medical monitoring. Appropriate medical monitoring doesn't require next-of-kin notification templates. The doctor's patterns shifted to a deeper blue, which indicated either deep thought or barely suppressed panic. Human physiology is complex. Complex how? Have you read their species file? The complete one, not the recruitment summary. Vex'andra hadn't, actually. The recruitment summary had seemed sufficient. Bipedal mammals, average lifespan, standard atmospheric requirements, moderate physical capabilities. Nothing that suggested they required more extensive research than any other carbon-based recruit. Perhaps you should, Dr. Kelethvar suggested, their patterns now cycling through colors that definitely indicated panic. And maybe avoid any training exercises that might trigger their adaptive responses. What adaptive responses? But the doctor was already gathering their meal and equipment, their patterns flashing in the rapid sequence that meant this conversation is now over and I have somewhere else to be immediately. They paused at the edge of the table, their voice dropping to the subsonic frequencies that usually preceded very serious medical advice. Vex'andra, my friend, there is a reason that humans are the only species in galactic history to have domesticated predators for companionship. There is a reason their homeworld is classified as a Class 9 death world, and there is a reason their application to the galactic community was initially rejected by 17 different review committees. Do not mistake their politeness for harmlessness. With that cheerful thought, Dr. Kelethvar departed, leaving Vex'andra alone with her growing collection of questions and a meal that had suddenly lost its appeal. The breaking point came 3 days later. Vex'andra had reached the limits of her patience with what she perceived as institutional favoritism masquerading as safety protocols. If the human recruit wanted to be treated equally, then they would get the full Vex'andra experience, a training scenario so demanding that it would either reveal why they needed special monitoring or prove that the warnings were bureaucratic overcaution. She designed the exercise herself, drawing on decades of experience in breaking down recruits who thought they were ready for military service. The scenario combined extreme physical demands with psychological pressure, a simulated rescue mission in hostile territory, with time constraints that made success nearly impossible and stress factors calculated to trigger panic responses in most species. The other recruits were excused from this particular exercise. Officially, this was because it required specialized equipment calibrated for bipedal anatomy. Unofficially, Vex'andra wanted to see what the human would do when pushed beyond reasonable limits without the distraction of other participants. The exercise began in a mock battlefield environment, a maze of obstacles, simulated enemy fire, and environmental hazards that would challenge a recruit's physical capabilities while testing their ability to function under extreme stress. The objective was simple: navigate through hostile territory, locate and retrieve a wounded civilian, represented by a training dummy, and return to the extraction point within 20 minutes. The time limit was deliberately impossible. Most recruits would recognize this within the first few minutes, and either request assistance or make tactical decisions about which objectives to prioritize. The point was to observe how they handled failure and adapted their strategies under pressure. The human recruit listened to the briefing with the same polite attention they showed everything else, asked 2 technical questions about the equipment parameters, and then stepped into the exercise arena with an expression that could best be described as mildly interested. For the first 5 minutes, everything proceeded normally. The human moved through the initial obstacles with competent efficiency, navigating the simulated hostile fire with appropriate caution and demonstrating reasonable tactical thinking. Their performance was exactly what Vex'andra expected, adequate but unremarkable. Then the scenario parameters shifted to the maximum difficulty settings. The change was subtle at first. The humans' movements became more fluid, their decision-making faster. When simulated enemy fire increased in intensity, they didn't seek better cover. They analyzed the firing patterns and moved through the gaps with timing that suggested they had done this before. When environmental hazards activated, they adapted with the kind of split-second improvisation that usually took years to develop. But it was the expression on their face that made Vex'andra's chitinous plates begin to itch with unease. The human wasn't panicking or struggling with the increased difficulty. If anything, they looked more focused, more alert. There was something in their eyes that hadn't been there during regular training, a sharpness that suggested the safety protocols and regulated environments had been holding them back rather than challenging them. The automated systems registered the change first. Emergency protocols that had been dormant suddenly activated, filling Vex'andra's command station with warnings and status alerts. Atmospheric processes came online. Medical teams received automatic notifications. Somewhere in the base's administrative systems, incident report templates began auto-populating with preliminary data. The human reached the wounded civilian dummy in 12 minutes, 8 minutes ahead of Vex'andra's most optimistic projections. They secured the objective with clinical efficiency and began the return journey, moving through obstacles that had been designed to slow retreat with the same fluid adaptation they had shown advancing. It was during the return leg that Vex'andra realized she might have made a significant tactical error. The human's physiological readings were unlike anything she had seen from other species under similar stress. Instead of the elevated heart rate and stress hormone production that indicated system overload, their biological markers showed a controlled, sustained increase in performance capacity. It was as if stress wasn't degrading their capabilities but unlocking them. More disturbing was their response to the simulated threats. When holographic enemies materialized in their path, the human didn't react with the startled flinch or momentary disorientation that most beings showed when surprised. They responded with immediate, efficient violence that suggested they had been expecting something like this and were prepared to deal with it. The exercise was designed to be safely impossible. The human was making it look routine. They completed the full scenario in 17 minutes and 37 seconds, delivering the civilian dummy to the extraction point with the same polite efficiency they showed everything else. When Vex'andra emerged from the command station to debrief the exercise, the human was standing at attention, not even breathing hard, with an expression of mild curiosity. Was there anything else you needed me to demonstrate, drill instructor? They asked, their tone suggesting they were genuinely interested in additional challenges. It was at that moment, looking at a recruit who had just casually accomplished something that should have been impossible while various automated systems screamed warnings about protocol breaches and emergency response activations, that Vex'andra began to understand why humans came with so many warning labels. The full realization arrived the next morning, delivered in the form of Dr. Kelethvar and a datapad containing the complete human species file that Vex'andra had never bothered to read. Endurance predators, the doctor explained. Their bioluminescent patterns cycling through colors that indicated they were delivering information they really didn't want to think about. Their entire evolutionary development was based on pursuing prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. They don't stop. They don't get tired the way other species do. When their stress response activates, they don't seek safety. They start hunting. Vex'andra scrolled through physiological data that read like a catalog of biological weapons. Adrenaline systems that could sustain enhanced performance for hours. Redundant cardiovascular mechanisms that prevented exhaustion-induced failure. Neural architecture that remained functional under levels of stress that would incapacitate most sentient species. The atmospheric processes, she said, the pieces finally clicking into place. In case they hyperventilate and alter the local oxygen balance, Dr. Kelethvar confirmed. Humans under extreme stress consume atmospheric resources at rates that can affect environmental systems. The structural integrity monitors. They tend to be destructive when their hunting instincts engage. Not maliciously, just efficiently. They'll go through walls instead of around them if it's faster. And the diplomatic immunity waivers. Dr. Kelethvar's patterns shifted to a deep red that indicated profound discomfort. In case they accidentally kill someone, humans don't always recognize surrender behaviors from other species. When they are in what they call the zone, they prioritize threat elimination over threat assessment. Vex'andra set down the datapad and stared at her office wall, where 17 different warning signs had accumulated like bureaucratic prayer flags. Each one suddenly made perfect sense, and the sense they made was deeply unsettling. So when I designed that exercise to push them beyond their limits, you probably triggered every predatory instinct their species has developed over millions of years of evolutionary optimization for persistence hunting, Dr. Kelethvar said helpfully. The good news is they maintained enough situational awareness to recognize it was a training exercise. The bad news is we now have empirical data on what happens when humans enter what the military calls combat effectiveness mode in a controlled environment. And what happens? They become very, very good at violence, and they enjoy it more than is entirely comfortable for the rest of us. The conversation that followed involved reviewing the exercise recordings, during which Vex'andra discovered that the human's performance had been even more unsettling than she had realized. The video analysis revealed movement patterns and tactical decision-making that suggested they had been operating on an entirely different level of situational awareness than she had assumed possible. The scary part, Dr. Kelethvar observed as they watched the human navigate a particularly complex obstacle sequence, is that this is a perfectly average example of their species. They are not enhanced or genetically modified or specially trained. This is just what humans do when they need to. And the warnings were to protect the other recruits. The warnings were to protect everyone, including the base infrastructure. That afternoon brought a new development, transfer requests. 7 different recruits had submitted applications to continue their training at other facilities, citing various personal and professional reasons that carefully avoided mentioning their human colleague. The crystalline being claimed they had received an urgent communication from their homeworld. The gas-form entity discovered a sudden interest in specializing in atmospheric sciences at a facility that was conveniently located several star systems away. Most telling was a hive mind fragment, whose request included a note that their collective had voted unanimously to pursue educational opportunities that did not involve learning what humans consider recreational violence. Vex'andra found herself facing a philosophical crisis that cut to the heart of her training methodology. Her entire approach was based on the principle that equal treatment created equal results, that subjecting all recruits to the same challenges would reveal their true capabilities and build character through shared suffering. But equal treatment for a species that had evolved to view extreme challenges as interesting entertainment was producing decidedly unequal results. The human wasn't being broken down and rebuilt like other recruits, they were being activated. The solution, when it came to her, was elegant in its simplicity and deeply disturbing in its implications. The next morning's training briefing included a new addendum to the equal treatment policy. All recruits will be subject to identical training standards, with appropriate modifications to ensure that challenges remain challenging rather than recreational. The footnote explaining what constituted recreational for humans was 3 pages long and included warnings about activities that might trigger their species' enthusiasm for what they called extreme sports. Base Command approved the modifications with suspicious speed, suggesting they had been waiting for exactly this realization. Dr. Kelethvar provided a supplemental briefing on human psychology that explained why their species found combat situations invigorating rather than traumatic, and why their concept of playing often resembled other species' idea of warfare. The human recruit adapted to the new protocols with the same polite efficiency they showed everything else. When Vex'andra explained that their training would be modified to provide appropriate challenges for their biological configuration, they nodded understanding and asked if this meant they could finally use the advanced combat scenarios they had been hoping to try, which led to the creation of an entirely new training track, officially designated Species-Specific Advanced Combat Applications, and unofficially known as the Human Thing. It involved challenges that would be considered suicidally dangerous for most species, supervised by medical teams who had received additional training in human physiology and a maintenance crew that had been briefed on rapid structural repairs. The other recruits observed these specialized training sessions with a mixture of fascination and horror. The humans' calm enthusiasm for scenarios that would traumatize most sentient beings provided an educational experience that no amount of theoretical xenobiology could match. 6 months later, Vex'andra received a commendation from Base Command for innovative training methodologies and interspecies cooperation. The human recruit graduated with honors, having demonstrated proficiency in 17 different forms of armed combat and 6 techniques for unarmed threat neutralization that the Academy's instructors hadn't even known were possible. The graduation ceremony included a moment of silence for the 3 holographic training opponents, who had been so thoroughly defeated that their programming required complete reconstruction. As Vex'andra watched the human receive their assignment to a deep space reconnaissance unit, the kind of posting that required operating independently in hostile territory for extended periods, she reflected on the lessons learned. Her commitment to equal treatment had remained unchanged, but her understanding of what equal meant had expanded considerably. The final warning sign appeared on her desk the morning after graduation. Species Integration Protocols, Revised Edition. She opened it to find new guidelines for training programs that accommodated beings whose idea of character-building exercise resembled everyone else's idea of a survival horror scenario. The irony was perfect, really. She had gotten exactly what she had always insisted she wanted: true equality in military training. The universe had simply arranged for her to discover that equality with a species that considered warfare a form of recreation came with some unexpected administrative overhead. The human had departed for their new assignment with the same polite courtesy they had shown throughout training, thanking Vex'andra for the educational experience and expressing hope that they would have opportunities to apply their training in practical situations. Their enthusiasm for practical situations had been somewhat unsettling, but Vex'andra had learned to appreciate the subtle differences between species in how they expressed professional interest. Her office was finally free of warning signs, though the emergency response protocols remained permanently upgraded. The next batch of recruits would benefit from her expanded understanding of species-specific training requirements, and the Academy's reputation for producing competent military personnel remained intact. She had successfully maintained her core principle: no one received special treatment. They had all been treated equally. It was just that equally had turned out to be a more complex concept than she had originally anticipated, and the universe's sense of humor had a distinctly satirical edge to it. The human, for their part, had never shown any awareness of the chaos they had caused simply by being enthusiastically themselves. Which was probably for the best, considering that their idea of being helpful might involve offering to demonstrate advanced applications of the techniques they had learned. Some gifts, Vex'andra had decided, were better left unwrapped.